What's up, Toro students? I'm Mr. Martinez, and welcome to History Talks. If you don't know, History Talks is a new learning module system that we're trying during semester 2, where our lectures are actually recorded and packaged into a nice Edpuzzle where students can learn and do assignments at their own pace as many times as they want to. For this history talk, we're going to be focusing on the topic of World War I, and more importantly, the causes that start the First World War. Let's just have a real quick recap on that history real quick. In the summer of 1914, Europe went to war with itself. It was a war that many expected to be short. In fact, it lasted more than 4 long, terrible years, taking the lives of millions of combatants and civilians. Matter of fact, in some cases, entire high school graduating classes of young English, French, German, and Russian soldiers died fighting one another along the Western and Eastern fronts. In this learning module, we will learn the several causes that led to this tragedy. So what are you supposed to do during history talks? Well, besides listening and learning and taking the small notes on information we're about to go over, which is on slide 6 of your interactive notebook, there'll be some small pauses during the lecture to kind of check in on how you are feeling about what you're learning and checking for understanding, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. Once again, all you must do is listen, learn, and take notes on slide 6, where we're going to be trying to understand the abbreviation called MAIN, which is great for understanding the main causes of World War I. Each of these will represent a concept that we need to know the definition and the term for. So let's get started. We're talking once again about the Great War. Now, our main focuses on this lecture is what are the 4 main causes of World War I? That is our essential question. If we can answer that, we were successful today. So let's learn that abbreviation of MAIN, with the first definition being militarism. Now, please put militarism in your notes right now and the definition you see on top. Now, what do I mean by militarism? Well, militarism is the development of armed forces and the buildup of weapons. So this is the military. This is weaponry. This is the military and force capabilities of a country, right? So how does militarism add to causing World War I? Well, let's take a look at the example we have here. If you take a look at our screen, we see a chart that's called Total Defense Expenditures for the Great Powers. So this is looking at all the different countries that are European nations involved in World War I. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, France, Britain, and Russia. And this is how much money they were spending and investing in weapons and military. If you can take a look from 1870 to 1914, you see a huge growth of investment into weapons. Now, as you can see, these numbers represent millions. So from 94 million from 1970 to 1914 being 398 million. Now, you have to understand, why would nations want weapons? Why would there be such an investment? Well, that adds a lot of tension and paranoia, you must imagine, from all the different neighboring countries. If your neighbor is starting to stockpile on guns and bazookas and tanks, I think there'll be a moment that you would be a little paranoid and say, what are you getting ready for? What are you preparing for? Which leads to other countries feeling a need to also prepare their defenses, get built up just in case, because that one is doing it. So maybe I need to do it. So it creates that paranoia of distrust, because why do you need so many weapons? As you can see right here on the breakdown of the different countries, all of them are investing heavily, and each other country is looking at one another saying, if you're doing it, there has to be a reason. I need to build up too. And this growing distrust. Now, militarism is a big thing for World War I, simply because after the Industrial Revolution, there is a new way of warfare, a new way of how to fight. Before going with simpler guns and less technology, with Industrial Revolution, we start to see a huge use of technology and inventions to be used to maximize damage on one's enemy. So in this time, we're starting to see guns become more automated, faster firing machine guns and things like that. We're starting to see metal machinery like tanks and also helicopters, or not helicopters, but rather airplanes. Airplanes being a new invention that starts to come out during this time. And also metal ships, battleships, capable of far more damage than a wooden boat. You're going to see all these things playing a huge role into the magnitude of World War II and its damages and legacy it leaves behind. With new warfare comes new problems and consequences from it. So, quick question for you. Why do you think militarism would cause tension to start a global war? Think about that for a second. Why would the buildup of weapons start to create tension between countries? Answer that question for us real quick. Good job. Thank you for responding to that. And yes, you're absolutely correct if you said the answer that militarism creates a growing distrust among countries when they start to build up so many weapons. Why do you need so many weapons if you're at peace? So let's carry on to our next definition we need to understand, which is alliances. So if we're looking at our notes, you just finished militarism with M. You're moving on to the A, which is alliances. So what is the definition for alliance? Well, what we need to understand with alliances, which is simply people teaming up and being on the same team, is that yes, it provided a measure of international security, but its issue is that it failed due as it made small conflicts into larger ones. So when you start to have conflict and it's between two people, it's a little bit easier to manage. Now imagine a fight that went from 2 people to 20 people. Which one of those arguments and fights are going to have bigger issues to solve? Probably the 20. The more people involved means more problems. Now, alliances were supposed to be a system to defend yourself, but it actually got people caught up more in the war and more into commitments to things that they wouldn't necessarily go through with if it wasn't for their commitment to a partnership or an alliance. So you're going to see this being a huge deal in World War I with the 2 different teams that start lining up and the 2 different people who've committed to that team that if anything was to go down, they will join the war, even if it didn't even involve them. But because their friend is involved, they got to show up and back their friend. So you have your triple entente, which is Great Britain, France, and Russia, versus this other group called the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. We'll talk more about why they lined up that way, but understand alliances is one of the problems that causes World War I. So going back to my example, this war, believe it or not, doesn't even involve any of those names in the first beginning incidents of the war. Rather, this war is between 2 different countries that we're not normally familiar with, Bulgaria and Serbia. And something goes down between these 2 that leads to their friends having to get involved with the war and conflict that comes with it. So as you can see here, this problem of 2 becomes a problem of far more. Checkpoint. Let's think about that for a second. Why did a small fight between Bulgaria and Serbia become a global conflict? How would you answer that right now? Great job. Yeah, when it comes to this, we're talking about the magnitude of damage. So when we're talking about why did a small fight between Bulgaria and Serbia become a global conflict, it's because of the alliance system. The alliance system got more people caught up in an incident that made them obligated to participate in a war. So as you guys can see on this one, this map right here, you see the two different teams and kind of the setup they're in, with one team kind of more spread out and encircling the other. That will be a big deal later when it comes to war experiences and who ends up winning. Next definition. So we just finished militarism, alliances. Now we're on imperialism. And out of all of these definitions, I hope you're familiar with this one because we had a whole unit on it. So yes, imperialism is definitely a cause for World War I. If you guys remember, imperialism is talking about economic and empire rivalries sharpening by the conflict and led to competition for world power. So we understand imperialism is when a country is trying to build up their economy by buying stuff and taking more resources or trying to get more land to have more of that world power status. But what happens when multiple countries are trying to compete? Multiple countries are in that same race. Well, eventually, you're going to get in a fight with somebody. And when you're trying to take something, someone else might try to claim it, defend it, or want it to. And this leads to a huge issue. Take a look at this map real quick. As we know, European nations were one of the first to do a global imperialism like this, where now you can see a large expansion around the world. You see, all of these countries have some ownership on some land that's outside of their motherland. So now their goal is to either defend it, expand, and by expanding, by taking more from others. So you see the orange team and the green team taking lots of land and now trying to defend it or take from the other team. So question for you guys for this checkpoint is, with what you understand about imperialism, how does imperialism cause a global competition? Good job. You're right. Imperialism creates that competition and demand of needing more land and resources by taking it from others by force. Good job. Our next definition is nationalism. So we did militarism, alliances, imperialism, and now we're on nationalism. Now, how does nationalism add to this? Well, what we need to know about nationalism is it's a hyper devotion to the interests and culture of one's nation. So nationalism is like someone who's very patriotic, very has lots of pride for their country, so devoted to their country that it's not just like being a good citizen. It's next level. You're willing to die for your country. You're willing to kill for your country. You're willing to do whatever it takes because you believe your country and your people are the best. And because you're the best, you deserve everything. That's what nationalism is. It's this hyper patriotic fever that kind of spreads through a lot of the world during this time. And it makes soldiers and average citizens give up a lot of their lives in the name for a war that they're not quite understanding why it's happening. That's what nationalism is. But all of these different definitions are just the recipe to start havoc. But we need an actual moment, an actual trigger, a spark that starts the actual fighting to start. And with that comes an assassination. That's right. We're talking about a very infamous assassination that literally led to World War I. Many historians argue that this bullet, or these two bullets, matter of fact, led to series and millions of more to be impacted by this war. If it wasn't for this assassination, potentially this would have never happened. So what happened in this assassination? What made that so grand? And also so strange as how it happened, as it's one of those weird things in history. Well, let's get the breakdown real quick. What's the spark? What I'm talking about is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, the Archduke of Franz Ferdinand is a huge deal. This guy, Franz Ferdinand, is a prince to an empire called Austria-Hungary. He visits a country that his family and country currently owns. And when he goes and visits this other neighboring country, him and his wife are murdered on June 26 in Sarajevo by a group of teenagers called the Black Hand. Now, this adds so much issues to what starts World War I. What happens is with the assassination of a prince, the king of Austria-Hungary demands justice, demands to know what happened in this crazy incident that took his son. To better understand this spark that is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, I would love us to watch a video that really captures both its impact and how incredibly weird this event was, as it almost felt like it was destined to happen against all odds. Watch this video with me as it captures that exact moment that did lead to World War I.
Alright, the stage is set. Now let's put the players in their places. The curtain opens on the back of a rundown cafe in Belgrade. A young man comes in carrying a package and takes a seat at a table with a handful of other young men huddled around. They still to a hush as he opens the package. Inside is a single piece of paper, a newspaper clipping. The one who brought the package bends over to stare at the page. One of the other young men slides a candle across the table so he can better see. Before him, circled in red, is a headline, and it reads, Archduke Franz Ferdinand to visit Sarajevo. Now we skip ahead a few weeks. We're outside a palace. A resplendently dressed man and woman are getting in an open-top car, 100 years ago this year. He's dressed in bright, blazing blue. His chest is full of medals. On his head, a grand horsehair cap. She is wearing a flowing white dress and laughing. He helps her into the car. This is Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, next in line for succession to the throne, accompanied by his wife Sophie. They've come to Sarajevo to watch military maneuvers, but really that's an excuse. It's their anniversary. They've come to get away from the stifling courts of Austria where the Archduke's marriage to Sophie will never be accepted due to her low birth. She was, after all, only a countess. But things have been really tense in this part of the empire. The Serbian agitators have been acting with increased boldness to demand a Serbia free and independent from Austrian rule. And this day, of all days, falls on the anniversary of one of the greatest battles in Serbian history, the Battle of Kosovo. It's one of the great rallying points of the Serbian people, a point of national pride. To Serbian nationalists, this is one of their proudest days. And to them, for the Archduke of Austria, the symbol of their oppression, the embodiment of foreign rule, to come here on that day was the greatest insult. Now, perhaps the Archduke had chosen that day to show solidarity, to ease tensions, to make the people of Serbia understand that he cared about their traditions. Maybe he simply didn't know that the day had any special importance, and he was just there to get away. But whatever the reason, he was ill-informed. For on any other day, the events that are about to play out may not have happened. On any other day, this might have turned out simply to be your average parade, an event which wouldn't even go down as a historical footnote in a long and prosperous rule. But something had to happen on this day. It was too symbolic, too important, too grand of a story. And so the first domino is placed in the mad and improbable events of this 28th day of June 1914. So here now, in the sleek black car, the royal couple begins to process down the streets of Sarajevo, flanked by 5 other cars filled with officials and guards. It's a parade. The streets are lined with onlookers, the route has been published, the world knows exactly where the Archduke is going to be. And those young men from that cafe in Belgrade are there in that crowd. They are nationalists. They're patriots. They're assassins and terrorists. They call themselves Young Serbia, and are part of the much more ominously named Black Hand. And they are angry. Angry in the way that only young men can be. And when I say young, I mean that barely any of them had reached the age of 20. They had in them an anger born of ideals, or they had ideals to rationalize their anger. A boldness born of a cause, or a cause to justify the brash kind of risk-taking that truly borders madness. But however you view them, here they were, hidden in the crowd, intent on killing the Archduke. One by one, the Archduke's car passes his would-be assassins. Nothing happens. No attempt on his life. 2 of his assassins ended up succumbing to fear and couldn't go through with the deed. One felt pity for his wife sitting in the car and just couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. Another one had an equipment malfunction. And so, one by one, Ferdinand passed them, none the wiser, smiling and waving to the crowd. Smiling and waving in an open-top car so the world could better see. But at last, on the Commercia Bridge, an assassin finally steps forward and throws a bomb at the Archduke's car. Seconds before it lands, Ferdinand sees it and dives behind the door of the car as the bomb passes over him and bounces into the street behind. An explosion rips through the ground, mangling the car following them and leaving 20 people wounded and bleeding on the street. The assassin leaps over the side of the bridge to make his escape, but in the type of amateurish planning that would be comical if the circumstances weren't so grave, he fails to realize that the river below is only 4 inches deep, and he hurts his leg in the fall. In one last act of comic tragic bravado, the assassin swallows the cyanide pill he's been carrying, a final "you'll never take me alive" gesture, but alas, these young high school assassins had bought their suicide pills on the cheap, and this one was way past its shelf life. So the young man just sits quietly vomiting into the river while the police stroll down to take him very much alive. The motorcade races back the way it came, sirens screaming, and the city begins to lock down. Another of the young men, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, watches the cars go by, heart sinking. So it's done, he thinks to himself. It's off. The Archduke is alive. The assassination's failed. He is pretty bummed out. His hopes to be immortalized in the halls of Serbian heroes are dashed. All his dreams of glory just shattered. Overall, it's been a pretty lousy day. So he goes off to pout, thinking maybe a snack will make me feel better. This one young man's comfort snack may seem like a small thing, but it's on the small things that history often turns. Back at City Hall, the Archduke and the mayor are having words. The mayor proposes that the Archduke and Duchess should continue on their trip, but the Archduke thunders back something like, "Are you crazy? You'd have us visit museums while bombs explode on your streets?" And then, in a gesture of gallantry that you don't often see anymore, he proposes instead that they immediately visit the hospital where the wounded were taken after the attack. So they don't hide him in a bunker or spirit him out of the country with a small army of guards like we would do today. Instead, they all pile out to the motorcade and start off towards the hospital. But nobody remembers to tell Franz Ferdinand's driver, and I should mention that this is the Archduke's personal chauffeur. Now, this fellow came along with the Archduke for the trip, but he's Austrian through and through. This guy does not know his way around Sarajevo. And so, as they're making their way through the city, the Archduke's driver makes a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, a street named for the Archduke's father. Meanwhile, our failed assassin, Gavrilo Princip, is sitting outside a deli, eating his consolation snack and starting to feel maybe a little better. And maybe this won't be his only chance, he thinks. Maybe someday he'll have another shot at greatness. I mean, it was a really bad day, but who knows, it could still turn out okay. He'd have to go into hiding for a while, but Holy is that the Archduke? Yes, right there in front of him, in the same open-topped car, was the Archduke and his wife. The driver had taken a random wrong turn onto the street where Gavrilo Princip was having a sandwich, and their car had just stalled out trying to back up. 3 strides away. Gavrilo can hear the Archduke and his wife talking from the car. No words, just actions. He stands up, he pulls out his pistol, and he fires 2 shots that change the world. The Archduke looks over, barely noticing the gendarmes wrestling the young man by the car to the ground. His only sight is for his wife, lying quietly on the floor of the car. He reaches out with a hand weak and heavy. Something's wrong with his neck, he can't quite think straight. He sees her and he utters one last wish. Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children. A man leans over him and asks if he's badly hurt, and he thinks he says, "It's nothing. It's nothing." He repeats the phrase, each time a little more quietly, and neither of them live through the hour. And so our first act is done. A martyred prince and princess, or the death of oppressors. An act of terror or a heroic strike for freedom. An act that relied on 1,000 coincidences. On a poorly chosen date, on a change of plans, on a misinformed driver, and on a sad young man having a sandwich. But no matter how you look at it, it was an act that began the greatest war in history, and brought to an end the world that all of these actors knew. This war would change the world. Join us next time and find out how the world responds to this event.
So as you guys could see from that video, there is a series of crazy events and coincidences that happen that almost felt like it was destiny in which Franz Ferdinand was to die on that day. From the multiple failed assassinations in the beginning, to then his driver taking the wrong turn where he would meet one of the escaped assassins once more, the street that the prince would die on that is named after his father, and the sad loss of himself, his wife, and his expected child that was within Sophia, that led to the anger and revenge that comes from Austria-Hungary in demanding justice. But as you guys can see from that video, history has perspectives. For the Bosnians or the Serbians, those teenagers called the Black Hand, they thought they were patriots. They thought they were doing the right thing by attacking who they thought was their oppressor. In their perspective, they thought they were doing what was right for their country. And when it comes to Austria-Hungary, it leads to provoking the biggest global war that will ever happen. This becomes a huge thing that triggers numerous events. For example, this right here. As you guys can see, action that happens from the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Like mentioned, the Austrian-Hungary emperor and leaders demand justice. They demand apologies and an investigation into Serbia. Of course, angry Serbians received a promise of help from their neighbor and friend, Russia. As these incidences were happening, Serbia reached out to Russia saying, if there was to be a fight, would you have my back? And Russia says yes. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, which then triggers Russia declaring war on Austria-Hungary. With Russia declaring war on Austria-Hungary, Austria-Hungary's best friend, Germany, decides to jump in and fight Russia for trying to back up Serbia. Once you see that, you see another country joining, which is France declaring war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. And with that triggers Britain joining France and Russia into the war. And now the alliances have been triggered. Everyone is now involved in this war. Quick question for you guys. What is the spark that started World War I? How would you describe it at this point? Well done. Yeah, absolutely. Franz Ferdinand, the assassination definitely is the spark that we now know. The spark that does create these two lines of countries who are about to fight in Europe and in other stages around the world. Now, with that, you will see that there's going to be two different fronts with the Eastern and Western Front, something that we will focus next class on how this warfare was and the experiences for the soldiers who were a part of it. But what we now know is with those four main causes and the spark of assassination of Franz Ferdinand, all of this leads to World War I. Congratulations, you just finished your History Talks. Once again, all you had to do was make sure you listened, learned, answered the checkpoint questions within this Edpuzzle video, and of course, take the small notes that were needed on this slide. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this lesson, and I look forward to teaching you about trench warfare and World War I experiences.